Mal de Débarquement syndrome presents as a persistent, phantom sensation of rocking, swaying, or bobbing. These patients experience a continuous, unrelenting internal oscillation, specifically locked within the 0.2 to 0.3 Hz frequency band. Despite this specific phenotypic profile, diagnostic frameworks are heavily bottlenecked by a rigid prerequisite. To validate the condition, clinicians typically demand an external, passive motion event. The classic trigger is an extended maritime transit, such as a multi-day cruise. Mainstream frameworks also accept prolonged aerial transit as a catalyst for the syndrome. Even extended vehicular transit, like a cross-country car trip, is included on the standard diagnostic checklist. These physical disembarkation events are deeply entrenched in the semantic definition of the disorder. They act as gatekeepers, often determining whether a patient receives clinical validation. This reliance on travel history forces clinicians to evaluate the disease based on external circumstances rather than the patient's actual neurophysiological state. This creates a diagnostic gap for the spontaneous onset cohort. These patients present with the identical 0.2 Hz internal rocking profile, but their symptoms began while they were completely stationary. Lacking a clear motion trigger, these patients are routinely miscategorized. Clinicians often dismiss their symptoms as psychogenic, labeling them with anxiety-induced dizziness or conversion disorders. The standard argument suggests that without a moving vehicle to drive the central vestibular pathways, the development of a persistent motion phantom is physiologically impossible. Advanced neuroimaging and state-space computational modeling reveal a different neurobiological reality, where the pathology is driven by internal mechanisms. There is an absolute structural alignment between triggered and spontaneous cases. Both cohorts share the exact same internal oscillation cadence. An external vehicle is merely an environmental force that overloads a vulnerable circuit. In spontaneous cases, an internal metabolic or neurovascular crisis unmasks the inherent physical properties of the neural network. To understand the origin of this sensation, the focus must shift from the inner ear to the highly interconnected network of subcortical integrators governing human balance. The primary mechanism is the velocity storage integrator, located within the medial vestibular nuclei and the vestibulocerebellar nodulus. This integrator functions as a subcortical low-pass filter. It accumulates and holds sensory data to help the brain calculate body velocity and maintain spatial orientation. Under normal conditions, a robust network of inhibitory ventrineurons keeps this integrator stabilized. This locks the baseline state to a true terrestrial baseline of 0. Spontaneous MDDS occurs when these regulatory circuits fail. As the baseline inhibitory controls drop, the velocity storage integrator loses its stability. The system then collapses into its lowest energy mechanical rhythm. Because the subcortical architecture naturally oscillates at 0.2 to 0.3 Hz when uninhibited, the patient experiences a relentless internal sensation of swaying. An external boat ride forces a healthy network into this low-frequency rhythm from the outside. A spontaneous crisis causes the network to default into that exact same rhythm from the inside. The swaying sensation represents the uninhibited velocity storage network operating at its inherent biological resonant frequency, distinct from a recorded motor memory. This raises the question of what specific physiological shock disrupts these subcortical gates in stationary patients. Epidemiological data reveals a strong link to profound neuroendocrine crashes. Notably, 44% of female spontaneous cases cluster precisely around the hormonal shifts of perimenopause or menopause. The brainstem nuclei governing the velocity storage network are heavily populated by GABA B-sensitive neurons. These inhibitory pathways act as the biological resistors for the subcortical system. Acute events, like a sudden drop in estrogen or a sympathetic fight-or-flight lock during trauma, drastically change the brainstem's chemical microenvironment. These crises cause a massive upregulation of inflammatory neuropeptides, specifically calcitonin gene-related peptide, or CGRP. CGRP interferes directly with GABA B-mediated inhibition. When these resistors fail, the brainstem drops its baseline inhibitory control, and the subcortical gates are forced open. The central nervous system is suddenly flooded with internal signaling noise in a physiological vacuum. Stripped of its baseline predictability, the network defaults to its inherent physical properties, unleashing a perpetual oscillatory state. The most precise neurobiological parallel to this condition is phantom limb syndrome. Modern neuroscience views phantom limb pain not as a peripheral issue, but as a central predictive error in the brain's somatosensory neuromatrix. Spontaneous MDDS is the literal vestibular equivalent of a phantom motion loop firing in a peripheral vacuum. We can analyze the shared neural architecture of these two conditions across 5 key clinical features. First, the hardware status. In both, the physical limb or vehicle is completely absent, yet the peripheral nerves and inner ear structures function normally. Second, the underlying error. Both involve a hardwired internal map that expects continuous baseline input, but experiences acute intrinsic disinhibition. Third, the unmasking event. A trauma, whether surgical amputation or a hormonal drop, abruptly cuts off normal baseline control. Fourth, the symptom profile. Both cause the brain to project a vivid predictive reality, resulting in a phantom moving limb or a persistent internal rocking cadence. Finally, the suppression mechanism. Because these are central errors, clinicians must use sensory illusions, like a mirror box or visual vection, to override the faulty internal map. In both conditions, a structurally sound central prediction engine has been uncoupled from real-time data, running a firmware-level error entirely on its own. This loop creates a severe internal conflict. While peripheral sensors correctly register zero acceleration, the uninhibited velocity storage flywheel continues to discharge its baseline resonant frequency. To compensate for this instability, the central nervous system undergoes a rapid, maladaptive sensory reorganization. The balance system begins to depend heavily on immediate environmental feedback to manually anchor the body against the internal drift. This explains why patients constantly seek out rigid physical surfaces or stable visual structures to ground their posture. Complex visual flow or unstable walking surfaces instantly exacerbate symptoms because they strip away these manual anchors. This behavior reflects a constant struggle to recalibrate the spatial vertical using alternative sensory inputs, while the central integrator remains locked in its intrinsic loop. Traditional habituation exercises fail for spontaneous MDDS because there is no peripheral inner ear deficit to address. Treatment requires targeted visual vection. Specific optokinetic protocols are designed to visually drive the velocity storage network out of its resonant loop. Coupling this visual stimulus with firm tactile baselines can re-engage central gating controls and re-establish a true terrestrial baseline. Vestibular professionals must move beyond semantic prerequisite dogmas and the artificial divide between motion-triggered and spontaneous presentations. Dismissing a patient because their internal gyroscope perseverated from a neurochemical crisis rather than an ocean wave represents a significant clinical failure. Diagnosing a central vestibular disorder must rely on evaluating the functional neurophysiological reality of the velocity storage mechanism, rather than the rigid wording of a textbook checklist.